While the young man stood there grinning, the people around him were discussing the fact that the gentleman would be fighting Newman with a shovel. The blonde gritted his teeth in anger. Xavier looked down at the hero and noticed that the metal shovel had been ordered from a blacksmith. Arcus covered his face with his hand and muttered that his son was an idiot who thought this was some kind of joke. The knight looked at the sight carefully and thought that if he remembered what the young man had been doing for the past month, it might not be a joke. The gentleman did general exercises early in the morning without complaining, then went to the construction site to explain the boiler room to the village engineers, and after that, trained with a sword until he wanted to sleep. This did not look like a man who was just joking. Xavier frowned, sure that the young gentleman was serious. The Baron raised his hand and announced that the duel between Lloyd Fra and the Knight Newman was about to begin. The man took a fighting stance and the boy grabbed the shovel with a grin. Xavier frowned, not understanding what kind of stupid stance this was. The blonde attacked first, outraged by his opponent's behavior. The brown-haired man swung the shovel and easily blocked his opponent's blow. The father and the swordsman standing behind him stared at the duelist in surprise. Newman swung again and thought that the young man would not be lucky a second time. However, this attack was also blocked by the young gentleman. Xavier's eyes widened, and he realized that this incredible and effective technique was used in real battles, as if his swordsmanship had suddenly improved after so many years. The opponent began to sweat and looked wearily at Lloyd. The young man grinned and thought that there was nothing surprising in this, because in Korea every man could do this. This is a modern hand-to-hand combat technique, a bayonet attack. He lunged with the shovel, and the opponent recoiled in fear. The hero covered himself with the tool, using it as a shield. Then he made another lunge with the tip, but the man dodged. The young man thrust the weapon into the ground and, laughing, began to jump on it. Xavier sweated and wondered if the aristocrat was really joking. The sweaty guy continued to laugh, but his gaze remained confident. The watching knight tried to understand his plan. Newman ran up to attack with a cry. The brown-haired man took a fighting stance and thought that the first thing he had prepared for the enemy was a shovel, and the second was the basic fencing that Xavier had taught him. The young man fought off the attacks and gradually pushed the enemy back. The man clenched his teeth in irritation, not understanding when the drunkard and scum had become so strong. The third thing the hero had prepared was this: a synchronized skill for handling a tool, digging level 1, become one with the shovel, body and soul. The level of synchronization between you and your shovel will increase. The guy swung, and his tool began to glow. Xavier's opinion of the hero increased by +1 during the training. The Baron and Baroness, who saw their son's sincerity for the first time in their lives, had it increased by +2 and +3. They added 97 RP, which allowed them to purchase an additional skill for 40 points. Then the hero realized that he had learned a pretty cool skill. He looked closely at his opponent. The man exhaled and swung his sword. Newman thought that he had no choice. It was unlikely that this should be used against an ordinary person, but he wanted to. A glow began to emanate from his body. Xavier narrowed his eyes. The enemy was pumping up MAA. The brown-haired man frowned, realizing this. The enemy was about to use a Mona heart. The mustachioed man grabbed the handle and, frowning, declared that now everything was serious. The young man did not answer, and the opponent rushed at him. The knight watching them frowned and thought that someone who had not had any talents for 10 years, even the most ordinary ones, would need at least 5 years to master the mana heart. The young master would not be able to block such an attack. The man swung his blade. The boy held the shovel in front of him, but the enemy only grinned, confident that he would cut it in half and break the aristocrat's skull. The protagonist's parents jerked in horror, and the woman covered her mouth with her hands. The blow hit the shovel, but it did not flinch. Newman stared ahead in shock. He felt like all his strength was leaking out. Lloyd smirked and thought that this was the fourth skill he had prepared, mana mastery, which made Xavier the strongest man in the novel. The knight watched the duel closely. Mana flowed into the boy's body through the weapon. This was the technique of the Asahan core. The man recoiled in fear and exclaimed that his mana had been drained. At that moment, the hero swung and hit his opponent in the face with a shovel. A broken tooth flew against the blue sky, which its owner looked at sadly. Lloyd's next blow was to the chin with the opposite end of the tool. The boy looked down at the swordsman with an ominous look and hit him hard on the head. Newman fell flat on the ground at his feet. Arcus raised his hand in confusion and announced that Lloyd Fra had won the duel. The blonde was lying on the ground and did not understand how such a master of the sword could lose to the scum. The aristocrat came closer, and throwing the shovel over his shoulder, said that the man had been beaten. The hero swung and said that it was time for the long-awaited punishment. The man looked up in fear. The Baron jumped up and shouted that the duel was already over. The young man began to beat the enemy with a shovel. Arcas frowned and shouted his son's name in rage. The knights immediately began to hold the protagonist so that he would stop hitting Newman with a shovel. Bayan stood next to Xavier at this time and looked at what was happening with an angry expression, suggesting that the protagonist had gone crazy. At this time, Xavier looked ahead with sadness and realized that Lloyd could have lost his mind. The Protan, at this time, waved his hands inside heavily because he ordered to let him go as he had calmed down. Then he put the shovel on the ground and his hands on his belt, sighing with relief. Then he started hitting his opponent with the shovel again, and they tried to restrain him again. Xavier looked through his bangs with displeasure and realized, if you look closely, that he was hitting him so as not to hurt him too much. At this time, the blonde with a mustache screamed from the blows. The brown-haired man at this time looked at his opponent angrily, but Xavier saw this calm expression on his face because he seemed to know in advance what would happen next, as if he already knew everything. At this time, the guy with blue hair looked ahead coldly in his memories. 15 days before the duel, the brown-haired man leaned his hand on the blade and wanted to learn the Azarin technique of the mind. At that moment, Xavier looked at him in surprise, and the brown-haired man did not understand such a reaction because he had asked to teach him something good and not to steal it. It was a silhouette of a man who absorbed the aura streams, because in addition to the assimilated mana, it can attract mana from what surrounds him and transform it into his. At that moment, the knight looked at him intently and asked the master how he knew this because he understood that he had always kept this technique a secret, as it was still not complete. Lloyd looked at his teacher with wide eyes and said that he helped him fall asleep, and Xavier talked about it in his sleep. At this time, the main character, with a malicious grin and a masked face, looked at the teacher, who understood that it was only his imagination that now imagined him with an iron mask on his face. The blue-haired guy looked intently at the brown-haired man, who threw his sword behind his head and, to his regret, said that he could not teach him this technique because it was still not complete. The main character raised his eyebrows with irony, asking if he could complete it, would he be trained? Xavier looked at him with disdain and said, "If you say so, then perhaps it would be so." But he was embarrassed by this self-confident look. Then Lloyd stuck his sword into the ground. He looked at his hands and tried to insert a finger into his fist, assuming that his mana heart was absorbing mana from outside by itself. Then he was about to hit his fist on his palm and assumed that it bounced off as a result. As he saw from the point of view of his heart, exter etal mana is something foreign. Then it was a silhouette of a man with outstretched arms who absorbed streams of aura because he wanted to change the source. The wit he absorbs from outside will not mix with the mana heart. It was a glowing core with pulses of light because he ordered to let it gather separately. This ball of light began to sparkle and emit streams because it needed to be rolled up and used. The brown-haired man began to rotate his finger near his fist with a grin and explained that it was like an auxiliary engine near the main engine because they were one whole, but at the same time worked separately, and it should be great. Xavier looked at him with displeasure and explained that he was sure that it was possible but did not understand where Lloyd came from before such reasoning. Then the main character stretched out his hands in front of his face on which there was an iron mask because he said that he simply imagined it. Xavier saw this expression and assumed that he clearly knew something but just did not show it. The protagonist looked at how his teacher stretched his hands to the sides and began to emit streams of light and aura, because he managed to complete the Asin technique of the mind, which had been being him for a long time. It was a blue core that emitted pulses of light around itself, because over the time of his first attempt, the number of contours that he could create increased to 3, and if he trained more, he could reach 4 or even 5 contours. A notification popped up that Xavier's opinion of Lloyd had increased by +5. The protagonist opened his mouth and bulged his eyes in amazement. He was surprised how much he had been taught the Mona Heart technique, because he didn't need it. He only wanted to learn part of the absorption, and he didn't need the mana around him, but only the one he touched. Young Mr. Lloyd had such an ability, so Xavier expected that he would defeat the Knight Newman. At that time, the guys were trying to restrain the protagonist, who was bloodthirsty, trying to finish off the lying fighter and triumphantly. At that time, the protagonist's father was furious, hitting the table with his hands because he did not want to allow him to ruin the knight's reputation any longer. Arcus watched his enraged son being restrained. At this time, the brown-haired man was sweating and trying to catch his breath when he heard about the knight's reputation. Then he pointed a finger at his father with pleasure and told him to look under the tablecloth before he decided whether these words were appropriate for Nikita's knight. A pile of sealed letters lay on the table under a white coverlet. Arcus looked at these letters in horror while Newman lay writhing in pain. The brown-haired man looked at his father and said that they were the furnishings of the estate, what the baron liked and did not like, instructions on how to forge property documents, and in these letters, everything that they managed to share. The protagonist looked at the agitated Newman with a cold face, not understanding how he found the letters he hid inside the walls. At this time, the protagonist smiled maliciously and said that in the novel Xavier found them later. He remembered how his little beast Patton went to get the letters last night. The father sat down on the chair in horror, looking at the table with the letters. Then he looked at his son, who was staring at him, and realized, as expected, that in the novel he was described as a kind person, because it would be a big fuss if he were to kill him now. Then he closed his lips with a dissatisfied grin and realized that the words kind ruler and good ruler meant completely different things. The protagonist looked at all the nobles at the table and realized that if his father was so worried about how to get rid of this man, then he could offer him something. At this time, the brown-haired man was holding his shovel while Newman was on the ground looking at him with excitement. Newman heard that they wanted to put an angry rat on his head and then expel him from the estate, wounded by rats, and if not, then they would demote him to an ordinary soldier and give him a chance to atone for his sins. At this time, the rest of the people were frightened by such a statement because they understood that it sounded inhuman. Arcus, at this time, his eyes bulged in surprise and understood that in order to carry out justice for a minor offense, he would be given a chance to atone but with a warning of a more severe punishment. Bane stood next to Xavier and frowned, saying that it was a wise and generous decision and a good warning to others. The protagonist looked at the nobles who sat on the platform and they agreed to do as he suggested. At this time, the knight with the mustache, without raising his head, said that he had no objections because he had just been shown mercy. The protagonist looked at him puzzled and tried to understand what kind of mercy he imagined, how a black silhouette of a man sat on a rug in front of his king. Lloyd understood if he would treat the criminals kindly and whether they would atone for their sins for the forgiveness granted to them, but he realized that this would not happen. Then his black silhouette laughed maliciously because he realized that in this case they would become more decisive and strong-willed, and would try to take advantage of their kindness. At this time, Newman grinned angrily and realized that they would regret this decision because he would definitely take revenge on this upstart. Newman looked discontentedly from under his brows at the protagonist, who was glad of his smile, and it was a pity that it would be his last. The beaten knight looked at his opponent in bewilderment and asked him to repeat. Then the main character gave a seed to his hamster, then he threw this beast high into the sun. Lloyd looked at Newman with bloodthirsty arrogance and declared what the best way to ask for forgiveness was, hinting that there was none. At this time, the hamster was deliciously devouring the seed. Then it began to increase in size. The blonde, along with Arcus, looked at what was happening in amazement. Bayan, along with Andre, were also scared and opened their mouths in horror. The rest of the crowd of people bulged their eyes in shock. From the black shadow, it was the same hamster that had grown in size. Newman's eyes widened in horror. His mouth opened because the hamster was about to fall on him. This huge pet was flying from the sky with its entire body towards Newman. At that time, the protagonist stood with his back to Newman, his hand on his belt, and there was a bang. The huge hamster was lying on the ground, having crushed the knight. The brown-haired man raised his finger up with a malicious smile and understood that such people should be driven out because this would solve the problem with the rotten man inside the estate forever. It was a vast mountain plain with fields. At that time, Padong was tossing the earth. This hamster was flinging it in all directions. Padong was digging a trench along the entire street of the city. The brown-haired man looked at him with a smile while Xavier tried to grasp what his beast was doing. Lloyd replied that he was preparing to broaden the road. They were weary and thrilled workers who were hauling materials in sacks. Then, moments later, they instantly became energized and upset with sweat because they suddenly turned into bold craftsmen. It was a lovely white tile laid in a path. Lloyd explained that in ancient times there was a city called Rome, and its residents adored roads greatly because they constructed a unique road system called the Via. The main character looked at the teacher with a smirk from under his bangs and said that they would now begin from the Baron's house and stretch the road to the eastern slope. The protagonist was about to depart, placing his hands in his pockets, while Xavier looked calm and tried to figure out why exactly this road, to which Lloyd replied that he himself would soon see everything. Xavier stared at the smile of his friend, who said that the fame of their village would soar. Then the main character glanced back with a shout when he was asked where he learned all this. The main character gazed at him closely because Xavier asked how he thought of a heating system they had never heard of before, and he also abruptly learned to call something from the via, and all this seemed like advanced magic. The blue-haired knight looked at him with scorn and asked if he was truly their master. A red message appeared about the danger that Xavier doubted him. The smooth character looked at him, widening his eyes. Xavier looked calm and composed. The brown-haired man tossed the shovel over his shoulder and thought with a grim smirk about when he read about this man in the book. He already knew that he was a skilled person and would easily guess if a stranger entered the body of the Baron's son. The angered knight was instantly going to draw his blade because this guy was not to be messed with, but there was no cause to worry because he had a special ability for such cases. Lloyd twisted his face in fear, his eyes wide because he studied in secret from everyone and believed that he could do it. A notice with a special ability of persistence popped up. Lloyd nervously clenched his body, approached the teacher, who told him that the young gentleman drank all day long. Lloyd realized that he was being observed every hour of the day, and maybe he used to be a real rogue, but he did not know anything about what he was doing all this time. Xavier coldly looked away and asked how he could clarify the skills of a spellcaster, because even a wizard with much experience sometimes cannot do this. Xavier stared at the brown-haired man next to him, who was eager, trying to defend himself, and asked him the answer to the question. How did he handle mana himself? Although he was barely over 20 because no one taught him either, and he should be a prodigy, but Xavier did not consider himself one. Lloyd opened his mouth in shock even more because he asked, could he be a prodigy? Why did the teacher not see himself as such? Because he thought that he suddenly became a brilliant spellcaster. Xavier looked at him closely with sweat on his brow and did not trust the knight. He watched as Lloyd instantly turned around with annoyance and began to leave, adding in pursuit that if he had nothing more to say, then he would go because he still had tasks to do. A notice appeared with a special ability of quick conversation and persistence. The brown-haired man continued to walk forward and tried to relax because he realized that Xavier began to mistrust him. Then, on the way, he met Bon while the workers were sorting the sacks and asked him to watch the progress of the work while he was gone. The knight in the coat replied that everything would be done and there was nothing to fret about. Then the brown-haired man looked back in surprise at the blue-haired knight who wanted to go with him because it was his duty to guard the young gentleman. Lloyd said with sarcasm that such clear things should not be said at all because he would surely go with him. The knight asked about the path. Xavier began to follow the gentleman, who tossed the shovel over his shoulder and looked joyful because he answered that they were heading to one place in the footsteps of an unpaid debt. The setting sun behind the mountain enveloped a small, distant town in the Rinia estate. There was a sign with the inn's name. At this time, the man angrily struck the table with his fist and was outraged. They were transported to the house of the swindler, Thus, who looked nervous and bitter because he had lost all his money and wanted to make all the rogues pay. At this time, a large guy in a black coat loomed over him and asked if this was not the nature of gambling, since he himself earned money this way. The brunette with a scar looked at the swindler with irritation and said that since he had such a build, if he was not able to pay for his services, then he would leave him immediately. These looked at the assistant with fear and said that he could pay and would even give him more, so he ordered him to stay near. His comrade in a black suit said that he would go instantly if he did not receive payment on time. The swindler angrily grabbed his head and said that he could only earn money by tricking others, but now too many people would want to settle scores with him, so it was worth staying quiet for a while. Suddenly, the main character burst into their house with a kick and realized that they were talking about him. Lloyd entered this room as the swindler instantly jumped up from such boldness. Lloyd looked at him with a sharp stare and realized that he had not seen him. The main character looked at him angrily through his bangs and introduced himself by his name. This, with great fear, widened his eyes and opened his mouth. This instantly put his hand on his assistant in black, who offered his help. But the swindler wanted to flee here faster. His assistant instantly bent over the ground, grabbing his master. Then they quickly jumped out of the house through the window. This man in a black suit was about to land on the ground. The man with a scar on his face became upset with frustration. Xavier, at this time, swung his blade near the shoulder. The knight instantly swung his sword in the air. The knight in blue walked down the street with his sword, ordered to hand over the swindler and leave himself, and then they would not touch him. Xavier looked at him through his bangs and realized that he had done everything as the young gentleman had planned. The big guy in the black suit looked at the man who had blocked his way with annoyance, who knew that they would try to escape through the window, which was why he had waited here. The guy in the suit frowned with irritation. Then the guy instantly, with bloodthirsty intent, stretched out his hand with a black magic core and joked about whether the knight even knew how to wield his blade. At this time, the brown-haired man looked through the broken window in surprise and realized that after the death of the bear, Xavier had yearned to fight because he had battled with the personal guard of the swindler, whose trail he had managed to strike. Xavier watched as the black mage emitted streams of dark energy because this was his first fight with a dark mage. The knight instantly sat down on the ground, baring his teeth from such pressure and holding onto his sword because it was not easy for him, and he had to resist the magic of gravity. Lloyd smiled wickedly because everything was just like in the book. The dark mage sent a stream of black core toward the knight. Xavier managed to raise his blade to deflect the attack. This black aura tried to surround him from all sides. He instantly found himself in a purple core with dark matter. The dark mage, with a grim smile, stretched out his palm because he understood that it was fated and Xavier must die. A huge fist instantly flew at him. The knight pressed himself to the ground with his feet and tried to desperately hold the blade. The dark magician looked at what was happening with confusion and a sullen smile because in the book, Xavier fought the scoundrel, being only a simple weapon expert. The blue-haired knight looked fiercely at his opponent with a core in his chest. It was a blue ball that analyzed matter along the axis because the real Xavier has a heart of mana triple ring. He instantly swung his sword and cut the barrier. The knight looked away in confusion and tried to grasp what it was, whether it was magic that controls gravity. At this time, the dark mage, with a drooping look, stretched out his fist in the sweat of his brow. The dark magician instantly soared into the sky to escape, but Thiz was outraged at such a trick. Xavier instantly went to the swindler, who stretched out his hands in fear because they wanted him for his deception of honest people. The swindler instantly flew into the wooden barrels. The knight proudly raised his blade over the scoundrel and said that he would cut off his legs so that he could only crawl into court. He instantly tried to slice the air with his blade. The main character instantly stood in his way with a worried look. Lloyd instantly began to angrily shout that Xavier had gone mad, because if he got to court in such a state, then punishment awaited him. The blue-haired knight instantly wilted and was shocked. The main character looked angrily from under his brows at his knight, who did not understand why his master showed sympathy for others.